Right, so now we start recording. I want to say a great welcome to this podcast. You are in fact my first guest of this unnamed podcast, which I have no idea what to call it just yet. But hear me out. This is the concept. I wanted to explore the people of KL. I want to explore the places around KL. So what I do is I gather up people who are amazing and ask them whether they could bring me to places they love and why. But today we're going off tangent because my guest, which I'll introduce in a bit, asked me for recommendations. So I decided to bring her to my favorite bar, Yu Coffee Bar at Jalan Tayton at Cheras. It's a very rustic cafe. It's a very homely cafe where the people around Connaught and Cheras will come and do their work, meet friends, and have a great cup of coffee. So now, without further ado, let's talk about our guest of today. So, would you like to say hi, Nadra?
Hi, Justin. So, my name, or
Yeah, just tell me
okay,
about yourself.
So my name is pretty long. I have triple N's in my name. Nadhrah Nadira. Yeah, so we'll just stick to Nadra for today.
No worries. So I know you're very busy, so let me do this real quick. I normally set a timer on my watch, so it means to tell me and remind me to really cut to the chase, not waste my client's time, and get to the nitty-gritty of what you do. So I have a timer for 1 hour right now, and let's dive right into why I invited you here and what do I want to know more about you. So the first things first, I understand that you're a psychology student from UCSI Connaught. I met you at Connaught Toastmasters, which happens to be a Toastmasters club in the university UCSI. And I just find you to be a fascinating person. You resonate so much energy, which I really vibe with. Your confidence when you speak in public, the passion you have for psychology, but not me talking about that. I want to hear it from you. So could you just go through a quick introduction about yourself and what you do?
I am currently a student in my first year, second semester, and right now what I'm doing is waiting for another job interview for my internship for my third semester, which means that in January I'll be in my second year, and I'm also involved in a few clubs, being Psychological Student Association or PSA, granted, Toastmasters Club, and I'm also working part-time at a public speaking academy, Mike Friend Academy.
That's fantastic. It means that you're preparing for job interviews or your internship, meaning you finish your exam. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
I want to go way back before that. I want to know about what makes Nadra so interested about psychology. Could you elaborate about that?
Sure, thank you for that question. I think I've always had a passion of helping people in general. I think I've always grown up to be that way. So I wouldn't say that it sparked from an incident. Maybe it's the way I was built, but since I was young up until now, it has not changed. Maybe sometimes wavers, but it's still there as a core.
And I would wonder, because to help people, there's so many ways to do it, whether it's in the medical field or in the social support, welfare, etc. Why psychology though?
Why psychology? Because I feel that I've found I've had the ability to connect with people emotionally, and I feel like psychology is the way to go. And of course, I could have joined maybe the medical field or the sciences or the like, but this one is for me. And psychology is so broad, which means that I don't have to decide just yet where I want to go in psychology to help people. So my options are open.
And you're right to say that psychology is indeed a really broad field. Let's talk about the many different niches and different studies that psychology has. What interests you and which kind of niche that you tend to go for?
Currently, I'm looking at clinical psychology. I know that clinical psychology is the most prominent one, especially in Malaysia. But I find that in clinical psychology specifically, there are a lot of interventions, which means that I have involvement in my clients' lives and improvement.
Now I know that a lot of my friends indeed are interested in psychology, especially when they are fresh off high school, but they are not too sure of how the pathway of this field works. Would you care to share a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Are you talking about degree-wise in where they can end up in, or
Perhaps the potentials that they could venture into.
potentials? So psychology is broad, as previously mentioned. I think everyone knows that. Though some of the few that I can mention as of now would be obviously clinical psychology. You could also be a psychiatrist, where you are able to prescribe medication. You can also join the counseling field. You can become a forensic psychologist. You can join human resources, marketing. So it's huge. It really depends on the person and what they're interested in, because psychology has everything you could possibly want. You just need to decide what you're interested in, and it has it for you.
Ah, so let's narrow back into your specific interest in clinical psychology. Well, how does that work? Would you have to do a general degree and then go into a specialized sort of training? How does it work?
Alright, so to be a clinical psychologist, I would have to have a background in psychology, which means that I would need to do my degree first in psychology, then move on to my master's, and then become certified. Though, fun fact, in Malaysia, you only need your master's to become a clinical psychologist. But overseas, I think in the US, if I'm not mistaken, US, UK, and the like, you need to do your PhD or PsyD to be certified as a clinical psychologist. PsyD is like a PhD but for psychologists specifically.
So from that logic, it means that a master's graduate doesn't need to be a doctor to be a clinical psychologist?
No, in Malaysia.
Wow.
Yeah.
And like through and in this way, you actually could venture into clinical psychology earlier than most people. And right now, could you tell me about where have you planned yourself and how would you pace yourself into getting to there?
How would I pace myself? That's a very good question, because it's a lot of reflecting onto how I want to get there. But right now, I think what I'm doing is just going around and then interviewing people from various different fields to also kind of explore what it means to be a psychologist in general. But I also have very supportive lecturers, which means that whatever it is in terms of talks or resources, they also help me out. Yeah.
Wonderful. And with all this great support and all, I'm sure you're very, very eager to get back to the community, of course. So let's talk about the things that in psychology that you've learned, the things that you've gone through in your lectures or in your training. Has there been anything that you have learned that changed your perspective of the world? Things that used to be what was commonsensical around the community, but then turns out, oh, it's not like that at all. Any myths that you have busted when you have learned psychology?
This is actually one of my favorite questions, because I feel like when I learned psychology is also when I started to change a lot of things in my life perspective wise, from the way I interact with people all the way to how I talk to myself. It's very broad, so where do you want me to start? Like with myself, with other people?
Of course, with yourself and with perhaps the most interesting thing you have learned.
I think one of the most interesting things I've learned is, do you know the phrase sleep on it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so everyone says sleep on it, but no one really explains the logic behind sleeping on it. So in psychology, it is fact that when your brain is always working constantly 24/7, your subconscious is ever running, it does not stop. Which means that when you think about something for a while and then you store it in your little storehouse of things, and then you sleep on it, it's actually processing, which means that by the time you wake up, you normally would have an answer, which is why people say sleep on it. Yeah. But that is also dangerous, because what you say to other people, it tends to also be stuck in some parts of their subconscious, whether they realize it or not, whether you realize it or not. So what you say to someone is actually very impactful. whether it be negative or positive. Well, obviously, if it's negative, then it's a lot more impactful to them.
And it's great that you mentioned about sleep because I'm such an advocate of having enough sleep, maintaining good health and all. Could you tell us more about sleep and how it affects our psyche?
Mm. I think it plays a lot into functionality because this is also very broad because I know of a person who's actually doing her final year project based on sleep because she cannot sleep during normal hours, so she'll do her work in the AMs, like I'm talking 3, 4, 5 a.m. and then sleep during the day, but she functions much better. Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into this, inclusive of a lot of research actually. Yeah.
And we of course could talk a lot about research. Is there a particular side of psychological research that you really, really love that you keep reading papers about?
Personally, I'm very much into personality. So breaking down personality, things like Myers-Briggs personality, the 16 personalities test, things like Ocean, the Big Five, DISC in terms of leadership. Yeah.
Which one of these personality tests would you feel is the most interesting to you?
I think they're all interesting in equal measure because they tend to measure different things. Like DISC is for leadership, but it also your personality plays a factor in DISC. So I can't choose a favorite one. I think all of them, in their own respect, are all very interesting.
Fair enough. And would you say, after knowing all these things, is there any actionable things we can do, knowing of our personalities and so forth?
Yeah, I think the thing about understanding personality or MBTI sometimes, the reason why people tend to not believe in it is because it allows you to put people into boxes, which means that once you understand that they're a certain personality type, you tend to stereotype them in ways in your head where you believe is correct, but it doesn't allow the person to show you who they really are without any bias or judgment from your end. Yeah, so I think that's one thing that is very interesting still.
With my, well, I do agree that it is fantastic. It's a great tool. One of the biggest applications I actually saw was when I was in my undergrad doing this global leadership program. That's what it's named after. What they did was they actually got our personalities and matched with other people whom we think we might work well with. And I think that's a fantastic application of one of these personality tests. I wanted to follow up on that and ask like with all these different tests and all and how people would evolve and change across the years, it means that sometimes these test results might not reflect the person at a certain time. With all these ongoing changes in dynamic, do you think it's important to have a test that is very constant, that could tell somebody's personality throughout his life or so forth? What do you think about that?
I think the reason why people tend to have different no the reason why people tend to ask you to redo the test after a certain amount of years is because they understand that change is inevitable. So they do ask you to retake it after 5 years, 10 years, or if you have gone through a life-changing incident like grief or a huge change like moving to another country. Yeah, so there is no specific test to show consistency in a person's behavior unless you know that the person's core is that. So example, are you familiar with DISC?
I heard of it, but I'm not too familiar.
Okay, so in DISC, there are 4 components, which is D dominant, I influencing, C is not sure what it stands for, but it's basically more data driven, and S, which is supportive. So all of these 4 domains, one has to do with your core as a person that is very difficult for it to change. So example, if a person is very dominant, very directive or is a natural leader, then their D would most probably be at a constant. Yeah, as an example. Though I don't think there are enough studies to kind of support how there is a constant pattern in this, because people do change.
Nice. And talking about all these different research that's ongoing, if you get to do your own psychology research, what will you do? And don't
That's-
worry, like you have all the money in the world, you can do whatever you want. What would you do?
It takes a lot of pondering actually. It takes a lot of pondering. I haven't decided yet.
Would it be somewhat related to the personality sort of stuff? Or would it be more or less on clinical sides and trying to find cures for certain illnesses?
I think most probably on the clinical side, because I think one thing that should be researched is, the constant comment that the younger generation is weaker. Yeah, so I'm actually very interested why that happens. Yeah.
The psychology of Gen Z's,
Yes,
quiet quitting,
yeah.
work culture,
Yes,
anti-work.
correct.
We heard so much of that in the news, and it's truly is a complex topic because when people of older generations criticize, I could not blame them because they gone through some ferocious timelines, world wars, famine, all this different kinds of stuff. And it's hard to draw apples to apples comparison when you talk about Gen Zs and debt and student loans or like pressures from parents and so forth. I think it's really hard to look into it, and sometimes it's hard to bridge that understanding between both generations. But I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I would say that it is indeed a great topic to go into. Do you happen to know any famous psychologists who look into it or have read works about it?
No, because now people are mostly just kind of focused on, I guess, the clinical side of things, but not really what is on trend. Yeah.
Fair enough. And when we talk about research, I'd like to know about Malaysia's side of research. Is there a lot of psychology research happening in Malaysia?
I'm not too sure, to be honest.
I guess we've been reading all those journals from the US,
Yeah,
Europe.
mostly.
We haven't looked back and reflect on how the psyche of Malaysians are like. I know some universities, like maybe Help University or like Monash, they do some of it, but not a whole lot of it.
That is true, that's correct. Because one of the things that my lecturer also brought up is that the reason why he decided to stay and continue in Malaysia is because of the lack of research and also lack of kind of empathy or awareness about mental health in general in Malaysia. So even if you do read articles that are very surface level and people don't normally go beyond to do research here.
Let's talk about mental health in Malaysia. We all are aware about the mental health crises that happen all around the world. But is there something that is truly specific to Malaysia or at least Southeast Asia?
I think specifically it would be work stress.
Work stress.
Yeah, because we're not, we don't really focus on well-being in terms of work. Even if we do, it's normally MNCs, multinational companies, that put mental health first, like as an importance, and even give exemptions in terms of counseling or visits to the clinical psychiatrist, clinical psychologist. Yeah. So if we're talking about local companies, more often than not, it is very rare for you to see them talking about mental health in general. Maybe it's the lack of awareness, also lack of resources, maybe because they don't understand the impact that it has on people. And I guess the whole discussion earlier on about how the younger generation is now weaker comes into play, because we are now also entering the workforce. Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into it. But if you have any specific questions about mental health, I'm happy to answer.
Of course. Just before we delve into mental health, I just want to add on that, yes, I do agree with you that maybe perhaps Southeast Asia hasn't taken the mental health sort of topic a bit more seriously, because we can see from countries in Europe or America, they have experimented with 4-day work weeks. Even for school, some of them have 4-day school weeks or something. And it turns out that the students or employees who gone through that sort of program work way more efficient than their counterparts who work 5 days or 6 days a week. So with tremendous results coming from these different countries, I could see that it brings enough evidence that, hey, I'm sure if it works in Europe, it surely must work in Southeast Asia. But perhaps there is many cultural aspects that we have not taken into consideration. And I hope people like you one day could, if you're interested, go into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in this sort of stuff. So now let's move on to the mental health side of things. And let's start off with a general question. What is the biggest mental health issue that you see in Malaysia?
Stigma.
Stigma.
First and foremost, stigma. When it comes to mental health, it's always stigma. When you have actual resources to reach out to people, if you're going through something, you go through stigma. If you talk about it, you go through stigma. It's just a very considered, quote unquote, sensitive topic here when it should not be. But that is the biggest issue.
And it's really interesting that you mentioned stigma, because my background is biomedical science, but I have done a systematic review research in the past. And my topic was finding out, why do people with dengue don't go see doctors in time before it develops into a serious condition. And of the literature that I've read, it turns out that some of these patients just feel that it's shameful to see a doctor. And I think that applies to the mental health epidemic as well. Many people feel weak when they go see a doctor, or they feel it's shameful. My friends would judge me, my parents would judge me, my peers would judge me, all this kind of stuff. And I would say that it's important that we, as the newer generation and the old one as well, to really keep an open mind and try to break out of this old stick way of thinking. Very unfair, I would say.
That's true.
When it comes to mental health and seeking help, what do you think? What do you think is? Do you think it's expensive? Do you think it's inaccessible? What do you think about accessibility for mental health in Malaysia? Mental health treatments or interventions in Malaysia?
Okay, so in this case, there are many tiers that we can talk about. If we're talking about professional, consistent help, looking for a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, then yes, it's expensive, depending on what you are also getting yourself into, meaning there are different kinds of therapy. So things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, which is more expensive, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, normally for bipolar patients and the like. Those start at around 300 per hour for the sessions, if we're talking about private practices. If we are talking about public, which is like government, that is also accessible, which I think goes around 1 ringgit per session, which is extremely affordable. But the drawback is that you have to wait in line for a very long time because it is so accessible. But if we are talking about accessibility in terms of maybe students or nothing too long term, universities are also open to taking clients for their clinical psychologist trainees. So sometimes it starts at a rate of maybe 5 to 10, which is also very affordable if you are working, and that's only once or twice a week. Yeah.
That's great. And just for context, 300 ringgit is around 50 to 60 US dollars. So it might not seem expensive in dollars, but to Malaysians, try to treat 300 ringgit like $300. It is quite expensive in that context.
Times four.
Yeah, and when we talk about the context where, oh yeah, in school, in universities, you have all these opportunities to seek or counseling or some sort of therapy. Have you volunteered for any of these sorts of programs?
Okay. In order for a person to be a clinical psychologist trainee who is running the sessions within the center, you need to be doing your master's. Yeah, so most of these people who are running these sessions as clinical psychologist trainees are doing the clinical psychologist masters. Yeah.
All right. No worries. I'm sure one day you'll be in that clinic and I'll come and pay a visit.
Yeah, thank you.
So following up from that question, I would really want to ask this question. This was given from a fellow friend of mine. We all know that people go to the hospital when they're sick, where people go to see a psychologist when they have some sort of issue going on. Is it true or is it relevant that people can also seek psychologists as if it's like a medical checkup? I don't have any issues, but I just want to do a checkup. Is that a thing?
Yeah, of course. I think there's also one thing called like a wellness trainer, if I'm not mistaken, who are kind of there as like a one-off thing where you go to them and then you talk about your issues, they give you advice, and then you go. Something very similar to a counselor. Yeah. But if you want to go for checkups, you can, though it might be a little bit tricky because you might need a background for that first. So in terms of like if you were to go for a normal medical checkup, you can go to the doctors and say, okay, maybe I have asthma, maybe I have bronchitis, stuff like that. You can mention the history and they would understand. But in terms of mental health, it's a lot more complicated because our experiences are very individualized, very personalized, which means that everything that fluctuates, stuff like that, is also very personalized in a way where in order for them to understand how you reached where you reached, they need to know how you got there. So what is your history like? Yeah, so for context as well, if anyone is interested in being a client in a center, is that what they'll ask you to do is the very first session is they'll have a background check with you, which means that they'll ask about family history. If anyone in your family has had any prior mental illnesses, what are your life experiences, what are you here for? Yeah. And then from there they will build up your case. So it's a little bit tricky to answer that question because of the amount of work, but it is very worth it. So I would say if you want to do a checkup, you can try to choose a place that is most recommended by your friends so they have your data and you don't get tired having to explain yourself over and over again.
Wonderful. And I would like to add on to that, like once a psychiatrist or a counselor is very familiar with you, is it possible, just like a doctor doing a early diagnosis before something goes into a serious condition, is it possible for psychiatrists to do the same, identify a problem before it comes up?
Yeah, of course. So there's actually this thing called the DSM-5, which is kind of like the clinical psychologist or any psychologist or counselor's quote-unquote Bible, where all of the psychological symptoms are in the book to identify whether you have the disorder or not. So from there, that's where they also train the trainees to identify these behaviors in these clients so that they can have earlier intervention. There's a specific name for it, kind of forgot what it was, but it can serve as an early intervention before it gets worse. Normally, from my understanding, is they can identify this in teens, normally, yeah.
In a way that I guess it helps with all those people who don't usually get diagnosis. For example, like in the perspective of autism, not many women get diagnosed until late in life, like in their 20s or 30s. And I think, in my opinion, if we build a repertoire with a client from an early age, we might be able to find out all these different conditions early on and cater their education, their training, and their personal life to have a more conducive environment for growth. And I think that would be a wonderful idea. And it's great that you answered my question that, hey, psychologists can do the same, just like early detection in cancer, early detection in chronic diseases, and knowing how to nip the problem in the bud before it's too late. So going on from there, moving away from the clinician's perspective and more to the personal side, is there any resources online for mental health if someone wants to just know about something? Is there a website people can go to?
There are actually so many, too many to name, kind of. I wouldn't exactly recommend helplines because they tend to be, if it's in terms of just asking a question, maybe not helplines, but questions like for diagnosis, or what kinds of questions?
Any sort. It could be about, hey, I want to know more about autism. Hey, I want to know more about work-life balance and mental health. I want to know more about a specific topic.
Okay, for this one, there are NGOs who do work with clinical psychologists. So if you go to pretty much any NGO, especially NGOs that are hosting like therapy sessions, example, there is an NGO called WIP Healing, which works with clinical psychologists who supervise them. Then you can ask them to get in contact with this clinical psychologist to ask questions. Yeah, I feel like that's the easiest way for you to get direct access to a clinical psychologist. It's either that, or you can also go to any private clinic, get their email, then ask them as well. Yeah.
Fair enough, because I always imagine like sometimes doctors would always go to poor, lower middle income neighborhoods, open a booth and let people come for consultations. I wish there would be the same for psychologists. They would just go to an area, could be a university, could be a very busy workplace or public space, have a booth just to give information, give resources and so forth.
There are actually, but maybe their marketing is not as good because of the lack of resources. But they do have it. They have talks, they have open booths, they have free screenings, they have things that are very similar to what doctors have as well. It's just that maybe it's not as well known because no one talks about how important it is.
I
But
see.
yeah.
Could you mention names of these organizations again?
One would be Ment Couch. That's actually very close to KLCC, maybe about a 5 to 10 minute walk. There's also Rekindle Therapy. There is one that is not a private practice but is open to the public for free art therapy, would be WIP Healing, as I previously mentioned. Sometimes, or most times, universities also go around to have booths as well, inclusive of UCSI, Monash, Sunway, Taylor's, Help. Yeah.
That's
They do as
wonderful.
well.
It warms my heart to see people giving back to the community because I always wonder, are these sort of interventions only exclusive to those who can afford it? And I sometimes feel terrible, like, oh, what if it's the same for mental health? But at least you cleared my doubts about it. It's great to hear that there are resources out there. It's just that we need to push more for more awareness and so forth.
Yeah.
So, right. So we talk a lot about different aspects of psychology already. We talked about the psychology scene in Malaysia, the different perspectives, the different interventions they are. We also talk about your pathway as a student at all. Could we talk about the broader picture of what you have in mind in your career? One day, what would you want to do? Open a clinic, work in a clinic? What's your idea? Or what is your dharma in life?
Mm, I'm trying to figure out how I'm able to help people and interview, but at the same time travel frequently. So we'll see where that kind of leads me, because I think there's a lot in psychology in which I have not explored yet, because like I previously mentioned, there's also art therapy, and you can get certified as an art therapist, which I did not know previously. So I think to kind of limit my options, it makes me cut off everything else. Yeah. So
Well, to travel and to also spread the your awareness about mental health and so forth, there's only one thing I could think about. You could be like Andrew Huberman, start a podcast, and then have conferences all around the
yeah,
states.
that's true.
And you could do it in the sense of maybe bring up art therapy, have this whole art jamming session or whatnot,
Yeah.
or music therapy or whatnot.
Yeah, say music therapy as well. So like many forms of therapy.
I think the sky's the limit when what you in terms of what you want to do. Just that you need to have that initial capital to start that project that you always wanted. So let's try to conclude. So we have just maybe 10 minutes left. If there's one thing that you want to share about psychology or anything, or just from yourself that you want to share to audiences, what would you want to share?
I think that asking for help should not be something that is shameful to do. And I know that it's very difficult for a lot of people to believe that because of the people that they surround themselves with. But please believe that once you step into these supportive spaces, they will become your safety net. It's just that it takes you a few steps forward to take that leap and then actually wanting better for yourself.
And plus, there are many resources out there,
Yeah.
NGOs who are willing to help you. So once again, could you mention these NGOs? What their names and what and yeah.
Ment Couch, which is a private practice. Rekindle Therapy for private, but if we want to be more accessible, then we have NGOs like WIP Healing. We also have universities that are a lot more accessible if you don't want to go to public hospitals like UCSI, Health University, IMU, most
One
universities.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that you're here today to share about all these different perspectives of psychology and also the resources that people could take actionable interventions if they are going through some tough times. So once again, thank you so much for coming here. I hope you enjoy the little matcha latte that U
Yeah.
Coffee Bar has prepared for you. Again, U Coffee Bar is a fantastic space in Tatenville, allowing the neighborhood or people from Cheras and beyond to come chill, relax, or maybe even do a podcast. So once again, thank you again, Nadra, for being here. And
Thank you.
I
Thank you
wish
for
you
having
all
me.
the best in your future endeavors, and hopefully to see you in the many road trips you have across the world, doing what you do best and making the world a better place.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.